Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 537, The New Order. America's occupation of Japan came to an end earlier than planned and with little fanfare late in the spring of 1952. The impetus, as with so many foreign policy decisions made by the United States during the 20th century, was the Cold War. Seriously, if you're trying to explain basically any decision made by the US government from about 1945 to 1991, the answer is almost certainly because of the commies. Specifically, the outbreak of the Korean War in the summer of 1950 drew huge numbers of American troops away from Japan and towards the peninsula, and accelerated an already growing trend towards abandoning the lofty early occupation goals of a total reconstruction of Japanese society in favor of simply getting things up and running, so to speak, as a Cold War ally of the United States. And so, on September 8, 1951, then Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshida Shigeru, found himself in San Francisco, signing a final peace treaty with the Allies. Well, with most of the Allies. Given the nature of the Cold War, neither Soviet representatives nor those of the new People's Republic of China were present, and given the ongoing Korean War, neither Korean government came either. Final peace deals with South Korea and China would wait until the 60s and 70s respectively. Technically, North Korea and Russia have never signed a final peace with Japan. The final treaty which Yoshida signed laid out the terms of Japan's readmission to the family of nations and the regaining of its sovereignty. Namely, the overseas assets of the empire would be confiscated, and everything other than the 4 home islands and some of the outlying ones given up. This, by the way, included Okinawa, which had been built up by the United States as a base for the potential invasion of the home islands late in the Second World War. While that invasion never actually materialized, Okinawa had become a major hub of American power in the Pacific, and so part of the deal made at San Francisco was that Okinawa would remain under American control. The United States did not return the territory back to Japan until 1971, and only then with the understanding that the US could continue to use its bases there. Beyond giving up Okinawa, there was one other price to pay. After Prime Minister Yoshida signed the peace treaty, he was then loaded into a car and taken to the other side of town to sign a separate document, the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty. This treaty had been a precondition for the end of the occupation, and though it was ostensibly an agreement between two equal powers, in reality it very much was not. Article 1 stated that, quote, Japan grants and the United States of America accepts the right upon the coming into force of the Treaty of Peace and of this treaty to dispose United States land, air, and sea forces in and about Japan. Such forces may be utilized to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security in the Far East and to the security of Japan against armed attack from without, including assistance given at the express request of the Japanese government to put down large-scale internal riots and disturbances in Japan caused through instigation or intervention by an outside power or powers. To translate from the original legalese, the US had the right to put its forces anywhere in Japan, to send them anywhere it wanted to contribute to the maintenance of peace and security, which is very vague language, naturally, and did not have to check in with the Japanese government before doing so. That last bit about large-scale internal riots and disturbances it's codifying the right in case of communist revolution or insurrection for the US military to sweep in and put the revolt down. Just as galling was the fact that no part of this mutual security treaty obligated the US to defend Japan in case of a war, it merely suggested that might happen, and that Article 4 laid out very vague terms for ending the treaty. Quote, "This treaty shall expire whenever, in the opinion of the governments of the United States of America and Japan, there shall have come into force such United Nations arrangements or such alternative individual or collective security dispositions as will satisfactorily provide for the maintenance by the United Nations or otherwise of international peace and security in the Japan area." Again, just to translate, that's a very vague precondition that leaves a lot up to interpretation, particularly because both countries have to agree that this new arrangement will provide for international peace and security. In other words, Japan could not unilaterally decide to end the treaty if a future Japanese government ever decided it was no longer in Japan's interest. It would need American permission to do so. Unsurprisingly, the new security treaty was enormously controversial from the jump. Leftists in Japan hated it because the document openly aligned the country with the US in the Cold War, and as a result, made the nation a potential battleground for World War III. And it's important to remember here that, it's something of a truism that one of the hardest parts of doing history is knowing how the story ends. We know the Cold War is never going to turn hot, but you have to remember in 1952, that's not a certainty. The risk of Japan getting caught in a nuclear crossfire between the United States and the Soviet Union felt very real. Even those in the political right, which Yoshida was, were not huge fans, given how obviously one-sided the treaty was. As early as 1955, the Japanese government began sending delegations to Washington requesting renegotiation of the security treaty, though those early attempts were all rebuffed. More ambiguous was the view of the wider Japanese public. For example, in his excellent series Japan: A Documentary History, David Liu translates an opinion survey done by the major daily Asahi Shimbun on the occasion of the coming into effect of the San Francisco and Mutual Security Treaties. There are a whole bunch of questions in this survey, all of which are great for getting a sense of the public mood. For example, the very first one is, do you think that as a result of the coming into effect of the peace treaty, Japan is now independent, or do you think Japan is not independent? 41% said yes, Japan is independent, but another 40% said some variation of no, either only in name or not independent, with the final 19% having no opinion, which seems pretty high for a fairly fundamental question. But then again, not having an opinion seemed to be the order of the day. For the question, during the period when Japan was under occupation, was there anything which SCAP or the Japanese government did which in your opinion is good? 47% said yes, 14% said no, 39% had, you guessed it, no opinion. For the same question, but replacing do anything good with do anything undesirable, the results were 28% yes, 26% no, 46% no opinion. And by the way, those who said yes were asked to elaborate on what was good or desirable. Their answers emphasized the promotion of democracy, followed by land reforms that made the countryside more equitable, improvement in women's social position, expansion of education, and economic assistance to Japan. Most interesting, in my opinion, are a series of 3 questions on the American military presence in Japan. First, respondents were asked why the US military remained in Japan despite the end of the war and the end of the occupation. The largest segment, of course, said no opinion, 30%. That was followed by to protect Japan, 21%, to guard against communist forces, 18%, to maintain Japan's internal security, 13%, due to a lack of Japan's defensive power, 11%, for the protection of the United States itself, 4%, and to place Japan under surveillance, 3%. The next question asked, who requested these American troops stay in Japan? 29% said both countries, 24% just the Americans, 21% the Japanese government, 26% no opinion. And then finally the respondents were asked, do you want to see US troops remain in Japan? 48% yes, 20% no, 16% each for we have no choice so either way is fine, and, of course, no opinion. So those are all some interesting numbers, but what do they actually tell us? Well, very roughly, I think they show us a society divided roughly into 3 chunks. Roughly 1/3 was fairly positive about the new order, roughly 1/3 opposed for one reason or another, and roughly 1/3 with no time for this sort of high-level consideration of the nature of Japanese sovereignty, because hey, the economy is still kinda in shambles, and the question of how am I gonna feed my family feels a little more important than all of this. And indeed, that's kind of the essence of Japan in the 50s. Everybody's kind of mad about how things are going, but they're all mad for different reasons. Which leads us into talking about the politics of the 50s, which are really important because they are going to set up the political structure of the post-war more generally, up to really the present day in a lot of ways. We're going to start off by talking about the Japanese left, which in turn was subdivided into 2 distinct movements, the communists and the socialists. There are, of course, and always have been, other branches of leftism in Japan, such as anarchism, but they never reached the same level of support as the more Marxist-aligned left. Now, the post-war era started off pretty great for the Japanese left, honestly. After all, the militarist right-wing government had taken Japan to literal ruin, and so by comparison, the left was looking pretty good. Plus, early in the occupation, when the Americans rolled into town, they let out all the jailed socialists and communists from prison and loaded their former captors into those prisons instead. The socialists and communists were even allowed to openly organize in ways that had never been possible before. In fact, in 1947, the socialists actually won an election. They picked up 150 seats in the Diet and were able, with the help of more centrist parties, to form a governing coalition and take the prime minister's seat. Given that the Socialist Party had literally been illegal just 2 years earlier, that was quite a feat. Unfortunately, things did not go great after that point. The reverse course, which we talked about last week, saw a crackdown on the union organizing that formed the backbone of socialist support, and the party's chosen leader, Katayama Tetsu, was by all accounts a lovely and very affable guy who did pass some great reforms to labor laws and expanded the social safety net, but didn't really have any ideas for addressing one of the most important issues, how to reboot the faltering post-war economy. As a result, he was kicked out of office about 10 months after taking it. And that defeat proved, let's call it, fateful. In time-honored leftist tradition, in the aftermath of Katayama's fall from grace, the Socialists' Party started to factionalize internally over arguments regarding why he had failed. Broadly, we can distinguish 3 big socialist factions that emerged as a result. First, you have the so-called left socialists, who tended to be more doctrinaire Marxists, in other words, convinced the capitalistic order of Japan had to be dealt with via a class revolution of the urban proletariat. You might be wondering, wait, wouldn't that make them a communist party, not a socialist one? Well, for one thing, the lines between those are a little more complicated than we're going to get into, with apologies towards those of you, and I know there are very many of these, who are very interested in the finer gradations of Marxist politics. For another, Japan's Communist Party at this point was actually more Maoist than conventionally Marxist-Leninist, and also more or less imploded in the early 50s when it decided it was time to launch a Maoist revolution in Japan. The time was not, in fact, ripe for revolution, and the Japanese Communist Party's insurrection accomplished little more than firebombing some police boxes and didn't really gather any public support. Not only did the revolution fail, but popular support for the party as a whole tanked, to the point that while it ran for elections after trying to overthrow the government, by the late 50s the JCP held only a single seat in the House of Representatives. On the other side, we have the right socialists, closer to what you would call social democrats, and more in favor of gradual shifts in policy via democratic means. And then, finally, we have the center socialists, who are pretty much what they sound like. They fall into the middle of the 2 extremes. Defeat proved very toxic for the dynamic between these groups, which ended up ideologically at each other's throats over the question of how to proceed in the post-war era. From the perspective of the left socialist leadership, the right socialists were basically counter-revolutionaries in sheep's clothing. They lacked an ideological commitment to change, and their leader, Nishio Suehiro, even tacitly endorsed an alliance with the United States and refused to call himself a Marxist. No wonder the workers had abandoned a party with such foolish revisionists in it. From a right socialist perspective, meanwhile, the left socialists were frothing-at-the-mouth lunatics, more invested in burning the system down than actually creating meaningful change in people's lives. No wonder voters had lost confidence in a party that was more concerned with revolutionary grandstanding than meaningful policy. These divisions were so stark that for a good few years, the Socialist Party actually split up into creatively named left and right socialist parties, with the two splinter parties being more focused on trying to cannibalize each other's voters than actually contesting the conservatives in elections. In 1955, the two parties would begin the process of putting aside their differences to reform a single party and challenge the conservatives politically, which sounds like a big step, but, well, let's put a pin in that. So, let's talk about conservative politics in the 50s, which are, in a certain sense, just as splintered, but for different reasons. Our story starts in 1945, just after the end of the war, with the formation of the so-called Gyuto, or Liberal Party. This was one of the first post-war parties to reorganize, primarily put together from former members of the pre-war Seiyukai. Its mastermind was a fellow named Hatoyama Ichiro, who we're not going to get into in too much depth here, because we actually did a whole series of episodes on his family, the Hatoyamas, Japan's biggest political dynasty. If you're curious about that, the series starts at episode 478. For the short version, Hatoyama Ichiro was the son of a famous politician and had been in the Diet for decades before the war, and was thus a natural fit to take leadership of the post-war conservative movement. His vision was a party committed to what we might call a traditional liberal worldview. Free markets, democratic elections, opposed to, from their perspective, the excesses of left-wing political movements. Hatoyama was banking on the idea that this was pretty much American politics in a nutshell, and that given America's victory over Japan, people would be drawn to an ideology that was associated with the winning side. And he was absolutely right. The Gyuto cleaned up in Japan's first post-war election in 1946. Unfortunately for him, Hatoyama wouldn't benefit much from this because right after the election, as he was on the cusp of becoming prime minister, something not even his famous father had managed, he was notified that SCAP had purged him because of his participation in wartime cabinets as a minister. Thus, he was no longer eligible for any office, including the prime ministership. And so Hatoyama had to go into a sort of forced retirement. Instead, the role of prime minister for the victorious Liberal Party fell to its second man, an old friend of Hatoyama's, Yoshida Shigeru, a figure who looms very large indeed in the history of post-war Japan. Yoshida, unlike Hatoyama, was not a politician by trade. He'd been a part of the foreign ministry, a diplomat who'd been pushed out of leadership during the war years because of a politically unpopular Anglophile streak. Because he'd been given the boot like this, unlike Hatoyama, he couldn't be accused of having collaborated with the wartime government. Yoshida would take the liberals in a different direction from Hatoyama. As a bureaucrat by training, he was inherently mistrustful of politicians and tended to recruit his closest confidants from the bureaucracy. For example, his two political protégés, Ikeda Hayato and Sato Eisaku, were both ex-bureaucrats, respectively from the finance and railway ministries. Hatoyama had also been an opponent of Article 9, the clause inserted by the Americans into the Constitution banning Japan from having a military. He felt, not without some reason, that it was an unfair restriction on Japan becoming a normal nation once again, particularly given that Germany had not been similarly treated during its occupation. Yoshida, by contrast, did not care about normality. he cared about pragmatics. Militaries were an expense that, barring a war Japan was unlikely to fight anytime soon, didn't offer much in return. He was more than happy to have an official reason not to spend money on an army, particularly once the Cold War got going and the Americans came to town saying, "Hey, actually, since you're our allies, could you build up some armed forces to help defend Asia?" Yoshida could point to Article 9 and say, "Hey, I'd love to help you, but we have this great constitution that you gave us, and we are so grateful for it, and it says we can't." He did sign off on some limited rearmament in the form of the modern-day Japan Self-Defense Forces, legally justified, so the government argued, because Article 9 banned war potential, which was a distinct category from self-defense potential, which is splitting hairs on basically the subatomic level, but it worked, and to this day, Article 9 remains a part of the Constitution, and the Jieitai, the self-defense forces, continue to operate with some restrictions in place to ensure their self-defense potential never becomes war potential. Hatoyama would eventually be removed from the purge rolls at the end of the occupation, at which point he went to his old friend the Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru and said, "Hey, thanks for holding down the ship, but I'm back now and I can take the Liberal Party over again." Yoshida, though, was unwilling to give up the party he'd spent such a long time building up. Sure, Hatoyama had founded the party, but Yoshida had run it far longer than Hatoyama had even been involved by this point, and so he said, "No thank you." From here, things unfolded in a way likely to be familiar to anyone who has ever experienced the world of petty personal drama. Hatoyama, furious, left to found his own party, the Minshuto, or Democratic Party, which, despite being also a conservative party, then went to war against the liberals. Seriously, Hatoyama ended up siding with the Socialists to hold a no-confidence vote and boot Yoshida from office in 1954. Not that the liberals responded any better. Hatoyama had suffered a stroke a few years back, and once he became prime minister, the liberals set about constantly calling him in for 10-hour sessions of questioning, one of the rights of any parliament, in hopes of re-aggravating his condition. You can see why, given all of this very petty drama, the left and right socialists felt they had a chance to take these people down if they combined forces. Unfortunately for the socialists, it didn't quite work out that way because once news got round that the socialists were planning to heal their old wounds and come back together, momentum began building among the conservative parties to do the same thing. After all, while Yoshida and Hatoyama each hated each other by this point, they were also both old men, respectively 77 and 72 at this point, and their younger protégés were less concerned with their infighting. The result was that, just a few months before the merger of the socialist parties, the Liberals and Democrats agreed to come together as well into a new party creatively named the Liberal Democratic Party, or Jiminto for short. The LDP, as it's known in English, has been the most dominant force in Japanese politics since it was founded in 1955. From that year, it has lost control of the national government for only 6 years in total, and that looks unlikely to change anytime soon. We'll get into the reasons why it has managed this in a future episode. For now, I want to focus on how politics for the next few years unfolded. At the time of the LDP merger, Hatoyama's Democrats were stronger than Yoshida's Liberals. Yoshida had governed the country during the vast majority of the occupation and immediately afterwards, but continuing economic problems meant many of his former voters were open to an alternative, as long as that alternative wasn't, the Socialist Party. Thus, the new LDP was very roughly 1 part Yoshida Liberals to 2 parts Hatoyama Democrats, and though Hatoyama himself would retire in 1956, one of his protégés would dominate the party for the next few years. That protégé was Kishi Nobusuke, formerly a bureaucrat in the Japanese puppet regime of Manchukuo who'd actually been imprisoned by the Americans during the occupation in preparation for a war crimes trial before those trials had been quietly abandoned during the reverse course. After dodging that particular bullet, Kishi went into politics and, depending on who you asked, either worked his way up to be Hatoyama's right-hand man by virtue of his dedication and talent, or cynically manipulated a doddering old man into giving him power. Confusingly enough, by the way, Kishi was also the biological brother of Yoshida Shigeru's protege Sato Eisaku. Kishi was the second of 3 boys and had been adopted by his childless uncle. Kishi's tenure as leader of the Liberal Democrats is important for setting the tone of the new party in a few different ways. For one thing, Kishi knew how to win elections effectively. During his time as prime minister, he was able to hang on to a majority during a general election in 1958 and decisively win a House of Councilors election in 1959, largely by virtue of good political messaging. He announced that revision of the Security Treaty, a popular cause across the political spectrum, would be the hallmark of his tenure in office. He was also very clever about playing on the economic anxieties of voters. In the 1959 House of Councilors election, he was able to win the LDP 10 more seats by focusing on a recently released economic plan penned by Ikeda Hayato, the heir of Yoshida Shigeru as the head of the Old Liberals, to double the average income in Japan over the next 10 years. He also wasn't above fighting dirty. Kishi went after the socialists as closet revolutionaries who wanted to throw Japan into chaos. He used the power of the government to go after their bases of support. For example, one of the most militant sources of anti-LDP opposition and support for the Socialist Party was Nikkyoso, the Japan Teachers Union, which Kishi was able to effectively break in 1958 through the installation over fierce socialist opposition of an efficiency rating system that graded teachers on performance. In practice, like all attempts to measure intangible things like good teaching through metrics, the numbers were very easy to manipulate, and thus Kishi's supporters in the education ministry could put together a case to fire the most militant members of the union, basically at will. I don't want to make it seem like Kishi was a political genius, though. He had a few bad missteps, too. For example, Kishi was very vocal in his desire, inherited from Hatoyama, to get rid of Article 9 and fully normalize the military, which did win him some support from conservative quarters, but also galvanized his opposition. After all, if you had even the slightest qualms about bringing the old military back, well, you'd better vote for the socialists, because, in particular, if Kishi ever won a 2/3 majority in both houses of the Diet, he would have the numbers to revise the Constitution, get rid of Article 9, and implement the policies he wanted. So you might not be a socialist, but you'd better still vote for them if you wanted to stop him from doing that. Similarly, a revision in 1958 to the police duties law, portrayed by Kishi as necessary to fight subversion by expanding rules around warrantless search, made him look like a wannabe dictator to many moderates who previously had been on the fence about him, and led some factions of his own party to be increasingly wary of their ostensible leader. And to be fair, Kishi did not do much himself to help this impression at all. He was a bureaucrat to the core, and had the classic Japanese bureaucrat's disdain for the opinion of anyone deemed less elite than himself, which is to say, basically everyone. Kishi was infamous for being snobbish, unwilling to listen to criticism, and generally just being, frankly, kind of an ass on a personal level. All of these factors came to a head in 1960 around one of Kishi's prize goals, and fundamentally shaped post-war society in the offing. The impetus was, of course, the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty, which after 3 years of pushing, Kishi was finally able to renegotiate with then-American President Dwight Eisenhower. The new treaty text was far more favorable to Japan. It actually did include a commitment on the part of the United States to defend Japan in case of attack, and some requirements around consultation before America deployed forces overseas. This time it even included a system for adjusting the... And this time there was even a system in place for adjusting the terms of the treaty or getting rid of it in the future, all of which gave Japan a lot more agency in the future of the security treaty and its relationship with the US than had existed previously. Kishi had every expectation that his revisions would be popular. After all, across the political spectrum, the security treaty had a lot of critics. What he didn't realize, though, was that those critics were coming from very different places. Generally speaking, right-wing nationalists as well as most liberals supported the treaty. After all, it created a way more equitable US-Japan relationship while still ensuring the country was protected by the world's greatest superpower against the threat of the Soviet Union. But there were plenty of others who were less than happy about the changes. For example, a surprising number of business leaders were concerned the treaty would distract from a more neutralist policy that would keep Japan out of the Cold War altogether, and more importantly, might potentially allow the country to trade with both the United States and the Soviet Union, and maybe even China, vast and close-by markets with a lot of potential to help rebuild Japan economically. Much more vocal, of course, were left-wing opponents of the treaty who remained worried that it tied Japan too closely to the US, and thus painted a giant target on the nation's back in case of hostilities with the Soviet Union. At first, it was mostly this left-wing opposition that made noise about the treaty. The revisions were announced in late 1959, and immediately left-wing groups began to organize to protest it, while the socialists announced plans to tie the treaty up in debate in the Diet. Kishi, after all, could sign the treaty, but it wouldn't go into effect until the Diet ratified it. Still, that opposition wouldn't be enough to stop the treaty's momentum, eventually. The LDP had a majority in both houses of the Diet, even if it didn't have a 2/3 one, and a small number of protesters could draw headlines, but not a lot else. But then Kishi made a huge mistake. You see, the socialists proved more effective than he anticipated at galvanizing protest and wasting time in the Diet, bolstered first by the overthrow of two US-aligned dictatorships in the spring of 1960, in Turkey and, more importantly, neighboring South Korea. This seemed to suggest to the socialists that unpopular US client regimes, which in their eyes was what Kishi represented, could be felled by massed protest. Then, and far more importantly, on May 1st, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over the Soviet Union, leading to a huge flare-up in Cold War tensions, and growing concern in Japan when it came out that several American U-2s were based there, though not Colonel Powers' plane, which was based in Pakistan. Even Kishi's own allies, or to his mind, subordinates in the LDP, were suddenly a bit less sanguine about calling a vote to ratify the new treaty, as concerns about being tied to the US in the Cold War suddenly seemed a lot less abstract than they had a few months earlier. Kishi was now staring down the barrel of a huge political mess. The Diet was scheduled to go on its summer recess on May 26th, and President Eisenhower had planned to come to Japan in June to celebrate 100 years of US-Japan friendship, 1860 being the year the Tokugawa shogunate had sent an embassy to the US to ratify the Harris Treaty. Kishi had this whole elaborate plan to present Eisenhower with a ratified treaty, make a big celebration of the whole thing, spike the political football, the whole 9 yards. Now it was coming apart in his face. But Kishi also had a plan. As far back as April 14th, he'd put together an Anpo Shonin Tokubetsu Taisaku Iinkai, or Committee on Special Measures to ratify the Security Treaty, though its members somewhat grimly nicknamed it the Anpo Tokkotai, or Anpo Kamikaze Squad. It was tasked with finding a way to get the treaty ratified by any means necessary, and oh boy, did they fulfill their mandate. On May 19th, as it was clear that ordinary measures were failing to get the treaty through, and exactly 1 month before Eisenhower was slated to arrive, Kishi struck. The Speaker of the House, an LDP member and Kishi ally named Kiyosei Ichiro, set up a motion to extend the Diet session by 50 days, planning to then immediately call a vote to ratify the treaty without any further debate or discussion. This was a very canny strategy. Japan still has a bicameral legislature, with the current upper house of councillors replacing the old upper house of peers. However, the lower house, the House of Representatives, has a lot more power, similar to the UK system where the Commons is much more powerful than the House of Lords. In this specific case, what matters is that the Constitution says that if the House of Representatives approves a law or treaty, and the councilors never vote on it, after 30 days that bill or treaty is automatically approved anyway, provided that the Diet is still in session over those days. So all Kishi had to do was get this quick little ambush vote finished, get the treaty vote done before the socialists could stop him, and after 30 days it would be the law automatically. On paper, it's pretty ingenious, if somewhat morally questionable, but things didn't work out quite as smoothly as all that. The socialists had been working on their own emergency plans, hiring up the brawniest young men they could find as secretaries to get those men freely into the Diet building. When word came down of what Kishi was doing, it became time to make use of those new secretaries. The socialists announced a sit-in, physically blockading the Diet with all of their assistants to prevent a vote on an extended session from taking place. Speaker Kiyose was physically barricaded into his office, while the socialists put the word out of what was happening, and outside, the protests started to swell. Many of these new protesters were animated less by concern over the treaty and more by the behavior of their prime minister, who was perceived, not unjustifiably, as acting in a very undemocratic way. Around 11 p.m. on May 19th, Speaker Kiyose took the extreme step of summoning the police to physically remove the socialist blockaders from the Diet building, only the second time the police had ever entered the Diet building, and the only time in Japanese history members of the Diet have been detained while inside of it, including during the pre-war and World War II periods. If you're wondering what the other time was, by the way, that was 4 years earlier in 1956, during some particularly intense debates over doing away with occupation-era school board reforms and re-centralizing the education system. The socialists were physically dragged out of the building by the police, and just before midnight, Kiyose was physically hauled up to the speaker's rostrum by his LDP allies. Votes were called in quick succession to extend the session and approve the treaty, all of this broadcast live by NHK. Both votes passed overwhelmingly, given that there was no longer an opposition left in the building. Kishi's maneuver got the treaty through. 30 days would pass and the security treaty became law. But it came at great cost. Even those who had no particular interest in the treaty issue now saw Kishi as a threat to the stability of Japanese democracy. The protests outside the Diet exploded. Tens of thousands of people took to the street for daily rallies against Kishi, and by this point it really was less of an anti-treaty protest and more of an anti-Kishi protest. Even conservative newspapers like the Mainichi Shimbun began calling for the prime minister to resign, as did business leaders who donated to the LDP but were worried about political instability. In the end, by mid-June, a series of violent incidents destroyed what little support Kishi had left. First, on June 10th, James Haggerty, President Eisenhower's press secretary, arrived at Haneda Airport in Tokyo to set up for the president's arrival in 10 days' time. His car out of Haneda was quickly mobbed by 6,000 protesters. They smashed the car up so badly the roof caved in. Riot police who tried to get to Haggerty were forced back with a volley of thrown rocks, and in the end, a U.S. Marine helicopter had to be sent in to get Haggerty out. 5 days later, protesters attempted to storm the Diet building itself, getting into a day-long street battle with the police as well as right-wing agitators who had arrived to counter-protest. In the ensuing violence, one of the protesters, a young girl named Kanba Michiko, was killed. None of this stopped the ratification of the treaty, which officially came into force at midnight on June 19th, though the instruments of ratification had to be snuck into Kishi's house in a candy box for his signature to escape the protesters outside. However, Kishi's popularity was in the pits. He resigned 1 month later. In my view, these protests are one of the most important moments in post-war history, first because it secured a cornerstone of Japanese foreign policy going forward. From these inauspicious beginnings, the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty would remain in force down to this very day, and the US-Japan alliance, though it was born in somewhat controversial circumstances as we've seen, remains a cornerstone of Japan's foreign policy. Second, Kishi's fall from grace would open up the doors to a radical remaking of the Liberal Democratic Party at the hands of the guy who took over for him, and would transform both the party and Japan itself in the process. But that's for next week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the remaking of the LDP.